Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
How did Mao come into power, and how did he keep it? Mao Tse Tung continues to be a controversial figure in Chinese politics. He is officially held in high regard in China as the great helmsman of the Chinese Communist Revolution who brought China into the 20th century and made it a world power. But at the same time, his political campaigns, such as the Great Leap Forward in 1958-61 and the Cultural Revolution of 1966-69, destroyed the economy and caused the deaths of up to 40 million citizens. Mao Tse Tung's rise into power is different from that of other rulers of single-party states, such as Hitler and Stalin. Hitler was part of the creation of the National Socialist Party from the beginning, while Stalin served as part of the top leadership of the Soviet Communist Party for years before taking over from the founder of Communist Russia, Lenin. Mao comes in between. He was part of the early leadership of the Chinese Communist Party from its foundation in 1921 and struggled with the other communists until the revolution of 1949. Mao was elected chairman of the Chinese Communist Party in 1943, and he became chairman of the People's Republic of China after the 1949 revolution. During the 1950s and 60s, Mao continually worked on consolidating his position as the absolute leader of China and led a number of campaigns to outmaneuver his political critics. These campaigns can be compared to Stalin's purges of the 1930s. From 1964 and onwards, Mao became the center of a cult of personality equal to that of Stalin. During the Cultural Revolution of 1966-69, this cult became firmly cemented, reaching a level of hysteria of such a magnitude that Mao himself had to call off the campaign. From then until his death at the age of 83 in 1976, Mao reigned unchallenged. In this episode, we will investigate Mao's way into power in 3 stages. First, 1921 to 1937, when the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, was formed and had to fight to establish itself. Second, the time 1937 to 1949, when the CCP fought to take power in China. And finally, the time from 1949 to 1976, when Mao consolidated and extended his own influence as the absolute leader of the communist movement and the People's Republic of China. China underwent 3 political revolutions during the 20th century. In 1911, the Chinese Xinhai Revolution overthrew the Manchu Empire and established the Republic of China. This was supposed to be a democratic, enlightened and modern society under the eye of the Kuomintang, a nationalist party created by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. After Sun's death in 1925, the Kuomintang, or KMT, was led by General Chiang Kai-shek, who took the party and the Republic of China in a more nationalist direction. Finally, after decades of fighting between the KMT and CCP and against Japanese invaders, China experienced the Communist Revolution in 1949. It is in this context that Mao's rise to power must be considered. The first stage of Mao's way into power was closely linked with the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party by Zhou Enlai in 1921 and its struggles to expand its influence until 1937. 2 main events shaped their fate: the Kuomintang's repeated attempts to destroy them and the Japanese invasion of China's Manchuria in the northeast. In the beginning, the communists worked together with the KMT. The Soviet communists encouraged the CCP to also obtain membership of the KMT, as there were only 1,500 communists and 150,000 nationalists. This changed, however, with the death of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The new leader of the KMT, General Chiang Kai-shek, hated communism and purged the communists from the KMT. In 1927, they fled to the countryside in what is known as the Agrarian Revolution and formed the first Chinese Soviet in Jiangxi province. After having gained control over northeastern China in the so-called Northern Expedition in 1926-28, Chiang Kai-shek began a series of 5 extermination campaigns in 1930-34 to destroy the communists in the countryside. In 1934, the Jiangxi Soviet was surrounded by KMT soldiers, and the communists set out on the long march from Jiangxi in the south of China to Shaanxi in the north. 100,000 communists marched 8,000 kilometers, crossing 18 mountains and 24 rivers, while being pursued by the KMT. Only 10,000 communists survived and could set up a new base in the village of Yenan. Mao's role in all this was quite central. He had been part of the leadership of the CCP since its founding in 1921, and in 1931 had been elected chairman of the Central Executive Committee. Together with the position of General Secretary, this position is one of the most central and influential ones in a Communist Party structure. But the Central Committee had 8 other equally prominent members, most notably Deng Xiaoping, who took leadership over China after Mao's death in 1976, and Zhou Enlai, who had originally been charged by Moscow to found the CCP, and later a Chinese version of the KGB. When Mao in 1932 took the Jiangzhou coastal area from the KMT, he did so against orders from the communist leadership. This gave Mao a high profile in Moscow, but at the same time he was denounced by all Central Committee members in China. During the entire struggle, Mao continuously acted on his own initiative without the consensus of the leadership. It is this will to act individually which eventually made Mao able to distance himself as a leader. As we can see, Mao's way towards leadership of Communist China was closely interlinked with the communist struggle to gain recognition and support and to avoid being destroyed by the Kuomintang. In this sense, Mao's road towards power reminds us mostly of that of Cuba's Fidel Castro, who also spent a couple of years being hunted by Batista's troops while trying to set up a rebel base in the Sierra Mountains. But for Mao, the struggle would be longer. First, there would be a second enemy to fight. The second stage of the communist and Mao's way towards power was that of war. This took place from 1937 to 1949, and there were 2 enemies to fight. First the Japanese, and when they evacuated China after losing World War II, the Kuomintang again. One of the CCP's strengths was a large following among the Chinese peasants. This came from Mao's 8 points for attention. When staying in peasant villages, the communist fighters had educated the locals, especially on the topic of land reform, meaning that the communists would take the land from the rich landlords and divide it among the peasants. The communist soldiers were also instructed to treat the villagers with dignity. They should not take food without pay and return or replace everything they borrowed, and they should help out where they could. This was in stark contrast to the KMT soldiers, who were not paid much but were allowed to raid the villages for food and valuables in return. The KMT government in the cities also became corrupt, angering the middle class. During Chiang Kai-shek's extermination raids against the CCP, the Japanese had seized the opportunity to invade and occupy the eastern Chinese province of Manchuria in 1931. The Japanese established their own little empire, Manchukuo, using the former Chinese child emperor Puyi as a puppet ruler. Both the KMT and the CCP fought the Japanese while also fighting each other. This did not go very well, and in December 1937, in what became known as the Seon Incident, the KMT and CCP temporarily joined forces. It came about when Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by his own officers and kept under house arrest in Xi'an until he agreed to meet with Zhou Enlai. Together they agreed to form the United Front for fighting the Japanese invaders. The fighting became successful, especially for the CCP. While the large KMT armies took most of the Japanese attacks, the guerrilla fighters of the CCP were able to liberate and keep small pockets of Chinese territory. In doing this, the communists maintained the support of the local peasants and middle-class Chinese due to their better treatment of the locals. By August 1945, the Japanese were losing World War II and pulled out of China altogether. The CCP and KMT now resumed fighting each other for the supremacy of China. By 1949, the communists had taken over North China and moved south to the capital of Beijing. The KMT was forced to retreat and fled to the island of Taiwan. It is because of this that Taiwan and mainland China do not get along. Taiwan considers itself the rightful China, the Republic of China, dating back to 1912. It is nationalist. Mainland China considers itself the People's Republic of China, dating from the Chinese Communist Revolution of October 1949. As we have now come to know, the Chinese Communist Party struggled for decades to establish itself, fighting both the nationalist Kuomintang and the Japanese invaders. The CCP established support among the Chinese peasants by treating them better than the KMT did and by promising land reform. After forcing out the Japanese invaders after World War II, the KMT and the CCP resumed their war against each other, eventually with the victory of the communists. Mao's role in all this was partly political, partly military. Guerrilla fighters, led by him and other party leaders, and generals Lin Biao, Zhu De, and Chen Yi, all fought on different fronts. But it was Mao who, as chairman of the Central Committee, proclaimed the victory of the Communist Revolution on Tiananmen Square, October 1st, 1949. For Mao, a new struggle would now begin. The third and final stage for Mao, in his way towards total control over China, basically lasted from the communist victory in 1949 and until his death in September 1976. It was one of political machinations and campaigns to modernize China and at the same time outmaneuver political rivals. Mao was very successful in this. An example of this was the 1956 100 Flowers campaign, designed to identify critics of the CCP and exile them to the countryside. Much more ambitious and far-reaching was the Great Leap Forward in 1958-61. It ran as the second five-year plan of Communist China, and the goal was for China to make a giant leap from agricultural backwardness into the forefront of the industrial age. Three main factors would ensure this. First, the peasants would be the main force, making this giant leap through revolutionary will more than actual knowledge and skills. Second, the new technique of deep plowing would open up for unrivaled agricultural production. Deep plowing meant to plow down 2 to 3 meters before sowing the seeds. Plants were then thought to grow to gigantic proportions, yielding massive crops. And third, steel was to be made at home in home-constructed so-called backyard steel furnaces. The whole of China's population took part. The traditional villages were uprooted and combined into huge communes with up to 5,000 families living and working together. They competed in promising ever greater yields for the coming harvest, as much as 10 to 20 times what the soil was capable of producing. And the backyard steel furnaces were kept burning day and night. All kinds of metal were thrown in, such as farming tools, doorknobs, and even cooking woks. But the steel produced was utterly useless. The Great Leap Forward led to great disaster. The exaggerated promises for the coming harvest had led the leaders to export more agricultural produce than usual, and now the Chinese peasants had no food. Crops had often not been harvested because everyone was busy feeding the backyard steel furnaces. Droughts and bad weather made the situation worse, and during the next 3 bitter years, an estimated 20 million people died of starvation. Mao's Great Leap had greatly failed. 2 main political consequences came from this. The Communist Party became internally divided, leading to the Cultural Revolution in 1966-69. and a cult of personality was formed around Chairman Mao himself. At the 1959 party conference at Lishan Mountain, Peng Dehuai, vice premier and defense minister and one of Mao's oldest and loyal supporters, wrote Mao a personal letter explaining the truth about the Great Leap. Mao refused to accept the facts and instead purged Peng Dehuai of his party posts. Lin Biao became the new Minister of Defense. Over the next few years, Lin created a cult around Mao, publicizing a little red book with quotations from Mao's speeches and writings, which was spread all over China. In the villages, peasants would get up in the morning and bow to Mao's picture, asking for advice for the day. Mao became prophet and God. The Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 69 was a dispute between rival groups in the Communist Party, which spread to include the whole population of China. The pragmatist wing of the CCP was led by Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping. They urged to abandon the large communes and backyard steel furnaces for more practical economic policies. The ideological wing, led by Mao's wife Jiang Qing and the so-called Gang of Four, argued that ideology was the most important factor for the revolution and that complaints about the economy merely showed a reactionary attitude towards the communist revolution. Mao stayed silently in the middle. He could not openly attack Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, but he needed the criticism of the Great Leap to stop. So he turned towards the young generation. Attack the party headquarters, he proclaimed, and criticized the representatives of the bourgeoisie who sneaked into the party, government, army, and all cultural circles. And so they did. From the 16th of May 1966 until autumn 1969, young people all over China abandoned school and work to instead criticize, denounce, and beat up anyone representing the bourgeois capitalist past. Anyone in authority was purged. Party officials, mayors, headmasters, school teachers. Parents were denounced by their children. Violence was rampant as students joined together in bands of so-called Red Guards, all claiming to protect the true Maoist ideology. If the Red Guards stopped someone on the street and they did not carry a copy of Mao's Little Red Book, they would be beaten up. Some Red Guards even fought each other. But more important for Mao, Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping were struggled against, which means persecuted. Party leaders and people of authority all over China were put on public display, beaten, and forced to admit their counter-revolutionary mistakes. Many were imprisoned. Peng Dehuai was purged again and beaten 130 times by the Red Guards. Tens of thousands suffered during the Cultural Revolution. Not only people, but Chinese culture as a whole was purged from conservative and reactionary elements. Every piece of art, be it painting, literature, or music, was reappraised along with communist revolutionary ideology. In 1969, even Mao thought the Cultural Revolution had gone too far and ordered the Red Guards to disband. Many people were again sent to the countryside, this time to cool off from the revolution. At the 9th Party Congress the same year, Mao was enshrined as the supreme leader of China, and Mao Tse Tung thought became the guiding ideology for China. It is still taught in Chinese universities today. Officially, the Cultural Revolution never stopped until Mao's death in September 1976. Mao was not challenged again. As we see, Mao instigated a number of political and economic campaigns during his time in power. Often these campaigns were aimed at removing critics from the center of power to the countryside, as with the 100 Flowers campaign in 1956 and the Cultural Revolution in 1969. The Great Leap Forward was a more radical step away from the usual communist 5-year plans, while the Cultural Revolution was an inter-party struggle which spread out of hand. Common for all campaigns was that they served both to reform China and to confirm Mao's leadership. By keeping people busy, moving them into communes, and having people struggling against each other on an ideological level, Mao kept himself firmly lodged as the central leader of China. In this regard, he can again be compared to Castro, who also launched massive food production campaigns, and even Hitler, who in 1934 purged the National Socialist Party of undesired elements. The enormous effects that Mao's campaigns had on China are still seen today. In conclusion, we see how Mao's way into power and his constant work on keeping it is tightly connected to China's communist revolution. During the first stage, from 1921 to 1937, the Communist Party was established and fought against the nationalist Kuomintang. During the Agrarian Revolution, the Long March, and while fighting both the KMT and the Japanese invaders, Mao repeatedly acted on his own, emerging as a leading figure within the party. After the Communist Revolution of 1949 and to his death in 1976, Mao instigated a number of campaigns, both political, economic, and ideological, all working towards transforming China, but also to consolidate Mao's own leadership. After the Great Leap Forward, General Lin Biao formed a cult of personality around Mao, publishing Mao's Little Red Book with quotations from Mao's speeches and writings. The Cultural Revolution 1966-69 conclusively confirmed Mao as the supreme leader of the CCP and China. It is difficult to say to which degree the campaigns were made to transform China or to enhance Mao's position. Probably the answer is a mix of both. Nevertheless, Mao's position as the helmsman of the revolution became unquestionable for good and for bad.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century Histories Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro was made by Andrea LaRose, while the music in this episode was made by Border Run. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.